Mr. President, from a purely formal point of view, this meeting arises from a complaint brought against the government of Israel. However, let me make it quite clear that sitting here as the representative of the government of Israel, as I have the honor to do, I am in no way sitting in the dock as the accused party. On the contrary, I stand here as an accuser on behalf of free and decent people in this world. I stand here as an accuser against the forces of evil which have unleashed a wave of piracy and terrorism which threatens the very foundations of human society. I stand here as an accuser of all those evil forces which in their inherent cowardice and abject craven attitude see blameless wayfarers and innocent women and children, yes, even babes in arms, a legitimate target for their evil intentions. I stand here as an accuser of the countries that because of evil design or lack of moral backbone have collaborated with these bloodthirsty terrorists. I stand here as an accuser of all those in authority throughout the world who for reasons of cynical expediency have collaborated with terrorism. I stand here as an accuser, sir, of this world organization, the United Nations, which has been unable, because of the machinations of the Arab delegates and their supporters, to coordinate effective measures in order to combat the evil of world terrorism. I stand here as an accuser of those delegations to this organization which for reasons of political expediency have remained silent on this issue, an issue which is bound to affect every country in this organization. In so doing, they have become themselves accomplices. Seated in the dock today, with the accusing finger of enlightened world opinion directed against them, are the terrorist organizations which are plaguing this world and whose representatives have in the past been seated here by the world body with rights equal to those of member states. In the dock are all those countries who have collaborated with the terrorists and who have aided and abetted them. There stand here accused those countries which have blocked every international move to deal with this plague of terror which besets the world. In the dock before us stand all those countries, they are all too numerous, who cry to the high heavens when they are affected by terrorists, who fulminate at this Security Council table when their citizens or diplomats are threatened, and who remain silent when the same happens to citizens of other countries. Some of them don't even have the doubtful grace to remain silent. They have the wicked effrontery to join in a condemnation of a country which tries to prevent these acts. In the dock before us stand the representatives of all those countries who stood and applauded the entry into the hall of the General Assembly of a gun-toting terrorist who, according to the President of Sudan, personally gave the order to execute the American and Belgian diplomats bound hand and foot in the basement of the Saudi Arabian embassy in Khartoum on the 1st of March 1973. Yes, sir, before us stands accused this rotten, corrupt, brutal, cynical, bloodthirsty monster of international terrorism and all those who support it in one way or the other, whether by commission or omission. Facing them today are the ordinary, decent human beings throughout the world who seek nothing more than to live a life free from terror and from intimidation, free from the threats of hijackers, the indiscriminate bombs of terrorists, and the blackmail of criminals and murderers. Israel's action at Antebi in order to release its hostages has given rise to a worldwide wave of support and approval, such as has rarely been seen from every continent, including Africa, from every walk of life, from countries hostile as well as friendly to Israel. The ordinary man in the street and woman in the street has risen behind us and proclaimed enough to this specter of terror, has cried out enough to this world body of pontificating diplomats in which on so many occasions moral cowardice and cynical expediency have combined to drag it down to the depths to which it has plunged. Mr. President, in more ways than one, this organization is in the accused stand today. Mankind will judge it by its behavior on this occasion, because never has the issue been clearer. Never has the issue been so clear-cut. There will be no excuse in history for this body or for the constituent members of this body if it fails to condemn terrorism. The issue before this body is not what Israel did at Entebbe airport. The issue before this body is its own future in the eyes of history. Mr. President, the representative of Uganda has very conveniently avoided the main issue before us. Let me recount the events as they occurred. On Sunday, the 27th of June 1976, an Air France Airbus flight number 139, en route from Tel Aviv to Paris, was hijacked by a group of PLO terrorists with 256 innocent passengers aboard, in addition to a crew of 12. The terrorists took advantage of the lax security measures obtaining at Athens airport and brought on board pistols and approximately 20 grenades. Thus began a methodically planned and carefully executed act of air piracy by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, one of the several terrorist groups joined together to form the PLO. Thus began another in a long list of PLO crimes against innocent civilians. Having commandeered the aircraft, the hijackers forced the French pilot to land in what is by now internationally accepted as the first haven for such criminals, namely Libya. This is the country which has for years acted as paymaster of international terror movements, Arab and non-Arab, throughout the world. It is, I submit, sir, a disgrace to this world organization that the representative of this world sponsor of terrorism is seated as a member of the Security Council, the purpose of which is to encourage the maintenance of international peace and security. To return to our story, the Air France plane was refueled in Benghazi. The destination of the hijackers was, in accordance with a previously prepared plan, Entebbe airport outside Kampala in Uganda. The Airbus landed at Entebbe airport on Monday, the 28th of June, and the hijackers were met by a reinforcement of terrorists who awaited them at the terminal, armed to the teeth with submachine guns and explosives. President Idi Amin of Uganda arrived at the airport shortly before the hijacked plane landed and embraced the hijackers in a gesture of welcome and a promise of support and assistance. Ugandan soldiers were then positioned with their guns trained not on the hijackers, but at the innocent civilians, men, women, and children. On Tuesday, the 29th of June 1976, the hijackers spelled out their demands. These included the release of 53 terrorists jailed in Israel, West Germany, France, Switzerland, and Kenya by a deadline of 3 p.m. local time, Thursday, 30th of June. They threatened to put the innocent passengers to death if their terms were not met. When the hijackers released 47 women and children and some passengers on Wednesday, the 30th of June, it gradually became apparent that President Amin was in fact cooperating with the terrorists under a cloak of deception and false pretense. This was the situation on the evening of July the 1st, the first deadline set by the terrorists. It became obvious that the Israeli passengers, men, women, and children, were in serious and grave danger for their lives. When the hijackers released a further 100 hostages, their story, when they arrived in Paris, revealed an ominous development. They described to the waiting reporters how Ugandan soldiers, under direct orders of President Amin, supervised the separation of Jewish passengers from non-Jewish passengers. Mr. President, this was a development of a nature so sinister and so pregnant with memories of the past that no member of the Jewish people, whether in Israel or abroad, could fail to recall its horrible significance. There flashed immediately upon the inward eye of every member of our people the memory of the terrifying selections carried out during the most horrifying Holocaust that man has ever seen, which beset our people. We recall the selections carried out by the Nazis in the concentration camps as members of the Jewish people were singled out for the gas chambers and extermination. Mr. President, following the never-to-be-forgotten experience of the Holocaust in Europe during World War II, an oath was taken, whether consciously or unconsciously, by every member of the Jewish people, wherever he or she may be, that never again would this happen, that never again would circumstances be allowed to develop in which such a catastrophe could happen, that Auschwitz, Dachau, and Buchenwald belonged to the past and would never again return. On this occasion, Mr. President, I solemnly reaffirm before this body the oath which has been taken by our Jewish people, wherever they may be. It will never happen again. And so, when this ominous reminiscent selection began, when the separation of the Jews was undertaken, it became apparent to the government of Israel that there was no alternative but to conduct a rescue operation to save the lives of its citizens. The government of Israel's apprehension was heightened by a knowledge of President Amin's attitude to the Jewish people. In September 1972, President Amin sent a cable, which was published on the 13th of September 1972, to the Secretary General of the United Nations, Dr. Kurt Waldheim, with copies to the Prime Minister of Israel and to the leader of the PLO, Yasser Arafat. In this cable, President Amin applauded the murder of the Israeli sportsmen at the Olympic Games in Munich, who, bound hand and foot, were gunned down by the PLO. Moreover, in the same message, he had the obscene gowlishness to praise Hitler for his role in destroying over 6 million Jews. Distinguished members of the Council will recall that but 9 months ago, President Amin in the General Assembly of the United Nations called for the extinction of Israel as a state. Mr. President, the combination of the move to separate Israeli and Jewish passengers from other passengers, the official endorsement of Hitler's policies by the President of Uganda, his call for the extinction of Israel, and the horrible fate of hundreds of thousands of his own countrymen who did not find favor in his eyes. In this connection, I refer you, sir, to the terrifying recital of the brutalities of what it refers to as the dictatorial fascist ruler of Uganda, published on the 7th of July by the government of Kenya. All these combined together to bring home to the government of Israel the realization that unless action were taken, the hostages, men, women, and children, were doomed and could expect no mercy in Entebbe. At this point, Mr. President, let me quote from the statement of Prime Minister Rabin to the Knesset on the 4th of July, and I quote, The time of expiry of the ultimatum drew increasingly closer. The release of non-Israeli passengers more and more exposed the evil conspiracy against Israeli citizens. The political efforts bore no fruit. The sand in the hourglass was about to run out, leaving no possibility for any independent rescue effort. Under these conditions, the government of Israel decided unanimously to take the only way left to rescue our people and declared its readiness to release terrorists detained in Israeli prisons. Following the cabinet's decision, we accordingly informed the French government, through which the negotiations were being conducted with the terrorists. We were prepared to adopt even this alternative, in default of any other, to rescue our people. This was not a tactic to gain time, and had this choice alone been left, we would have stood by our decision as a last resort." Unquote. The hijackers raised their demands. They announced that Israel would be held responsible for all the terrorists whose release they demanded, including those terrorists not held in Israel. And they refused to allow the exchange to be made in France or on neutral territory outside Uganda. Their sinister tone and new demands boded evil for the hostages. The government of Israel was left with no alternative. On the night of the 3rd and 4th of July 1976, the Israel Defense Forces mounted a most remarkable operation which will go down in history, rescued the hostages and escorted them to safety. I wish to reiterate on this occasion, Mr. President, that Israel accepted full and sole responsibility for the action, that no other government was at any stage party to the planning or the execution of the operation. The operation was planned and executed by Israel. We are proud of it. During that rescue operation, 3 of the hostages were killed by the terrorists before they were gunned down by the Israeli troops. A senior Israeli officer was killed, shot in the back, and several soldiers and hostages were wounded. Mr. President, the weight of evidence before us reveals prior knowledge and active connivance on the part of the government of Uganda in this whole episode. Even if the evidence were not available, and I say it is available in abundance, it is sufficient to read the letter addressed by President Amin to you, sir, on the 4th of July 1976, in order to reveal that he implicates himself in his own statement. It is quite evident from his letter that the Ugandan troops mounted guard not over the terrorists and the hijackers, but over the hostages. In the 5th paragraph of his letter, he states, I quote, "I directed that the plane be guarded properly," unquote. He then goes on to make the most incredible statement, and I quote, "The Ugandan armed forces were not allowed by the hijackers to go near the airport building," unquote. This is known to be false. The Ugandan troops were in and around the building. He then reveals his complicity in relating the story of the release of the 147 hostages on the 30th of June and the 1st of July, by openly admitting his part in separating the Israeli passengers from the other passengers. Mr. President, one does not really require all this evidence in order to prove that Israel was entirely justified by every norm of natural and international law to take the action which it took. In viewing the facts of the case, one must reach one of 2 conclusions. Either the government of Uganda was directly implicated in holding as hostages innocent passengers, men, women, and children, or the government of Uganda does not exercise sovereignty over its territory and was incapable of dealing with 6 terrorists. And what better evidence do we have to support this contention of ours than the fact that to date the government of Uganda has not released a 75-year-old lady, Mrs. Dora Bloch, who was on her way to the marriage of her son in this country when the plane was hijacked. Moreover, the refusal of the government of Uganda to release the Air France plane immediately after the hijackers were eliminated only tends to confirm the fact of complicity. What other reason should there be for the government of Uganda to refuse to return the plane to the French government in violation of the Hague Convention of 1970, to which Uganda is a signatory? If the government of Uganda is not implicated in this crime, why was a 75-year-old lady, Mrs. Bloch, not released immediately after the hijackers were eliminated? Why was she held in custody under guard in hospital in Kampala? Why was she not released to the British consul when he called on her on Sunday, July the 4th, after the rescue operation? Why have we suddenly been notified ominously that the Ugandan authorities, 4 of whose employees reportedly dragged her screaming from the hospital, are unaware of her whereabouts? Either the government of Uganda exercise national sovereignty, in which case it knows where she is, or it doesn't. I asked my colleagues, Africans and others here, who were joined to condemn Israel for exercising its inherent right of self-defense, do you or do you not condone the horrifying behavior which is reflected in this act of chivalry on the part of President Amin against Mrs. Dora Bloch, age 75? For once, have the courage of your convictions and speak out, or be damned by your own silence. Mr. President, here you have a plain, simple case which has no answer and cannot have any answer for decent people wherever they may be. Here you have the unbelievable, macabre spectacle of a state waging a war against a 75-year-old lady, supported presumably by those who would associate themselves with this despicable and cowardly behavior. If the government of Uganda is not implicated, let it now and forthwith produce Mrs. Bloch. Mr. President, does this Council propose to remain silent on the fate of Mrs. Bloch? The disappearance of this old lady and the by now all too familiar picture of the terrifying happenings in Amin's Uganda provide ample justification in themselves for the premonition which prompted the action taken by the government of Israel. Mr. President, this type of action, which in principle is not unprecedented, is dealt with at considerable length in international law, and there is no doubt whatsoever but that the weight of international law and precedent lies fully in Israel's favor. However, the Israeli action at Entebbe came to remind us, Mr. President, that the law we find in statute books is not the only law of mankind. There is also a moral law, and by all that is moral on this earth, Israel had the right to do what it did. Indeed, it had also the duty to do so. Mr. President, what mattered to the government of Israel in this instance was the lives of the hostages in danger for their very lives. No consideration other than this humanitarian consideration motivated the government of Israel. Mr. President, Israel's rescue operation was not directed against Uganda. Israeli forces were not attacking Uganda, and certainly not Africa. They were rescuing their nationals from a band of terrorists and kidnappers who were being aided and abetted by the Ugandan authorities. The means used were the minimum necessary to fulfill that purpose as is laid down in international law. Mr. President, summing up the daring and imaginative operation which we are discussing, my Prime Minister stated in the Knesset on the 4th of July that, and I quote, "This rescue operation is an achievement of great importance in the struggle against terrorism. It is Israel's contribution to humanity's struggle against international terror, but it should not be viewed as the final chapter. It will give us encouragement as we continue our efforts. But the struggle is not over. New efforts New methods and unremitting sophistication will be required. Terrorism will find us neither immobilized nor hidebound by routine." Unquote. In many ways, this is a moment of truth for this organization. If the Council will fail to seize this opportunity, which has been granted it, to eliminate the scourge of terrorists, kidnappers, hijackers, and blackmailers from our midst, then it will plunge to the lowest depths in the eyes of mankind and will disappear in history as yet another great and tragic lost opportunity in history. It has fallen to the lot of my small country, embattled as we are, facing the problems which we do, to demonstrate to the world that there is an alternative to surrender to terrorism and blackmail. It has fallen to our lot to prove to the world that this scourge of international terror can be dealt with. It is now for the nations of the world, regardless of political differences which may divide them, to unite against this common enemy, which recognizes no authority, knows no borders, respects no sovereignty, ignores all basic human decencies, and places no limits on bestial humanity. We come with a simple message to the Council. We are proud of what we have done because we have demonstrated to the world that in a small country, in Israel's circumstances, with which the distinguished members of this Council are by now all too familiar, the dignity of man, human life, and human freedom constitute the highest values. We are proud not only because we have saved the lives of over 100 innocent people, men, women, and children, but because of the significance of our act for the cause of human freedom. We call on this body to declare war on international terror, to outlaw it and eradicate it wherever it may be. We call on this body, and above all we call on the member states and countries of the world to unite in a common effort to place these criminals outside the pale of human society, and with them to place any country which cooperates in any way in their nefarious activities. In calling this body to action, Mr. President, I cannot ignore its limitations, which are daily demonstrated by the fact that this body, this Council, has sat silent through 15 months of the greatest tragedy besetting the world today in the Lebanon, while a nation is torn apart, tens of thousands are killed, tens of thousands more are wounded, and the cup of human suffering overflows daily. Let me remind you that when the hijacking took place, this Security Council was debating the report of the so-called Palestine Committee. The Security Council held 4 meetings on the Palestinian question while an act of terror carried out by Palestinian terrorists was taking place, yet this Council did not even see fit to raise the question and plead for the release of the innocent civilians. If this body fails to take action, we call on all freedom-loving countries in the world to come together outside the framework of this body, establish accepted norms of behavior in relation to terrorists, and declare in no uncertain terms that each and every one of them will have nothing whatsoever to do with any country which violates these norms and which encourages terrorism. Once hijackers have no country in which to land their planes, because receiving such a plane would mean exclusion from the world community or part of the world community, whether in the field of air transportation, trade, commerce, or international relations, there will be no more hijacking. We are proud to have given the lead in this struggle against international terrorism. This debate is an opportunity for the world to take action on this issue, which can affect the lives of every man and woman and child in the world. Those countries which fail to take a clear and unequivocal stand on this issue for reasons of expediency or cowardice will stand damned by all the decent people in the world and despised in history. There is a time, Mr. President, in the affairs of man when even governments must make difficult decisions, guided not by considerations of expediency, but by considerations of morality. Israel was guided by these considerations in risking much to save its citizens. May we hope, Mr. President, that others will be guided by these principles too. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the weight of evidence to prove Ugandan complicity has been growing by the day as the detailed statements of the hostages are analyzed and new evidence becomes available. We now know from the debriefing of the passengers that the map in the hands of the leader of the hijacking group, Wilfred Böse, which he produced immediately after the plane took off from Athens, was already clearly marked with the route Athens, Benghazi, and Entebbe. We know too, as has been indeed published, that before the arrival of the plane at Entebbe, Idi Amin dispatched his personal plane to Somalia in order to pick up and bring to Entebbe the leader of the terrorists who took control of the plane after it landed at Entebbe. Furthermore, the distinguished members of the Council are fully aware by now that 4 terrorists hijacked the plane at Athens. The evidence which I have produced and which many other distinguished delegates have confirmed shows that the plane was met at Entebbe airport by reinforcements of terrorists, some 5 in number. 4 terrorists hijacked the plane. 7 terrorists were accorded a state funeral with full military honors by the government of Uganda. In other words, by all accounts, including impliedly by Ugandan accounts, terrorist reinforcements appeared on the scene in Entebbe. In fact, we know they were driven onto the scene in 2 official Ugandan cars, one driven by a soldier in uniform. Shortly after 101 hostages were released on the 1st of July, the following dispatch was sent from the Associated Press in Paris. Quote, hostages newly released by hijackers of an Air Force jetliner arrived here early today and said 3 or 4 heavily armed men, apparently Arabs, were waiting to reinforce 4 original hijackers when the plane commandeered over Greece landed in Entebbe in Uganda, unquote. After the Israeli rescue operation, the French newspaper Le Monde gave full details of this aerial piracy in its issue of the 5th of July, which included the following, and I quote, à leur arrivée à Kampala, ils ont été rejoints sur la piste tout de suite après l'atterrissage par un groupe de 4 ou 5 Palestiniennes armées de mitraillettes, unquote. Similar reports appeared in many other newspapers, magazines, and on many radio and television stations. All reports were based on information given by released hostages and government officials. There is not the slightest of doubt in anyone's mind that, in fact, the hijackers were reinforced in Uganda. Furthermore, the important role played by the terrorists who joined the hijackers at Kampala adds further proof that also the Entebbe part of the hijacking was a carefully planned operation which could not have been carried out without the complicity of the government of Uganda. If Uganda was not implicated, how did it happen that these reinforcements were allowed to drive up? Why have those distinguished delegates who have identified themselves in so moving a manner out of a feeling of common interest with Idi Amin's Uganda and with the cause of international terror not addressed themselves to this rather strange development, which in itself proves their thesis to be false? Furthermore, if there was no connivance, where are the other terrorists? What has happened to the 2 or 3 survivors of the rescue operation at Entebbe Airport? Why have they not been apprehended and produced in accordance with the Hague Convention of 1970? In my statement on Friday, I already referred to the fact that the terrorists, always aided by the Ugandans, interrogated some Israelis, at times using force and even threats of death. The New York Times of Sunday, July the 11th, carried a vivid description of one such interrogation conducted both by the terrorists and the Ugandans, and I quote, during one period of questioning by the terrorists about what he really knew about Israel, Mr. Dahan was slapped in the face, punched in the back, and his fingers were twisted backwards. He was told to write long reports about Israel and proceeded to turn in documents dealing with kibbutz life and how he picked grapefruit. After one of these exercises, a Ugandan tore the paper out of his hand and threw it on the floor, saying, "This is not what we want. We want to know about the army. We want to know where the bases are. We want the name of your general." A tall Palestinian carrying a gun and another called George joined 4 Uganda officers in the questioning. At one point, George put a gun to Mr. Dahan's chest, unquote. In view of the overwhelming body of evidence corroborated by most of the 260 passengers and crew of the hijacked plane, I am left with no other choice but to call the 2 statements of the Foreign Minister of Uganda as nothing but the most formidable collection of distortions, half-truths, deliberate omissions, and outright falsehoods that this Council has heard in a long time. I shall not tire the Council by listing each and every distortion. They are too numerous to count and would prove to be very time-consuming. However, Mr. President, there is one abominable lie upon which my country cannot pass in silence, and it is incumbent upon me to show the true face of the President of Uganda and his Foreign Minister for what they are. The Foreign Minister of Uganda stated before this Security Council that, and I quote, "When she, Mrs. Bloch, got better in the evening of Saturday, the 3rd of July, she was returned by the medical authorities to the old Entebbe airport to join the other hostages. The Israelis committed a naked act of aggression by invading Entebbe airport, where the hostages, including Mrs. Dora Bloch, were being held by the hijackers. The members of the invading force took away all the hostages, dead, injured, or otherwise. The press reports and diplomatic sources, according to which one diplomat saw Mrs. Dora Bloch in hospital on Sunday, are false. There is no concrete information about it." So much for the statement by the Foreign Minister of Uganda before this Council. I repeat, Mr. President, this is a damnable lie. Mrs. Bloch was visited in a hospital by a British diplomat on Sunday, the 4th of July, after Israel's rescue operation at Entebbe Airport, as was clearly stated to this Council by the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. The diplomat reported that she was being guarded by 2 men, and when he returned an hour later, he was not allowed to see her. That diplomat, we were informed yesterday by the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, is to be expelled today from Uganda. We now have the ominous news that the government of Uganda is applying the threat of blackmail to foreign nationals in Uganda in connection with the current proceedings in the Security Council. In other words, for the first time in history, a direct attempt is being made by threats of blackmail of the most ominous character to influence the proceedings in this Council. How can this Council pass over this in silence? How can it ignore a blatant attempt to influence this body? How can the members of this Council ignore this flagrant attempt to interfere with their national sovereignty? This whole sordid affair condemns not only the government of Uganda, but all the countries which have spoken out against the Israeli rescue mission on this issue at this table. They have ignored the basic cause of this issue, namely the hijacking of the plane, and have not even had the good grace, for reasons of political expediency, to say one word about the fate of an old lady of 75 dragged out of the hospital, in all probability to the horrible fate meted out to tens of thousands of Ugandans, a fate the nature of which has been described by the distinguished Foreign Minister of Kenya in his letter addressed to you today, sir. With all due respect to the distinguished Foreign Minister of Mauritius and to other members who joined him in condemning Israel, the fact that they did not see fit even to mention in passing the fate of Mrs. Bloch, and did not see fit to address an appeal to the Ugandan authorities in respect to her whereabouts, removes from them the moral right to any standing in this debate. The case of Mrs. Bloch only emphasizes in a most tragic manner the scope of complicity of the Ugandans. And let me quote from a statement by Mr. Yigael Alon, our foreign minister, in the Knesset yesterday. The disappearance of Mrs. Bloch constitutes an inseparable part of the whole hijacking incident. The fate which befell her gives vivid substance to the awful danger which threatened the lives of all the hijacked passengers at Entebbe until they were freed in the magnificent rescue operation conducted by the Israel Defense Forces. It also proves for once and forever how empty and devoid of content, human, moral, and legal alike, were those voices which rushed to condemn Israel in the international arena for carrying out the elementary duty towards its citizens and saving them from this awful danger. Unquote. One's mind tends to be dulled and one's memory to be hazed as the debate goes on in this council. Let me remind the council that we are talking about a decision by the government of Israel to protect its citizens, hostages threatened with their very lives. Over 100 men, women and children held at gunpoint by terrorists who had hijacked them, who recognize no sovereignty, know no law, and who have proved in the past that there are no limits to their bestiality. These are the self-same people who shot diplomats bound hand and foot, who murdered sportsmen at the Olympic Games bound hand and foot, and who in the past have held children hostage and were ready to slaughter them. These people were being aided and abetted by a government headed by a racist murderer who had applauded the slaughter of Israeli sportsmen bound hand and foot by the same terrorists, who had called for the extinction of Israel in this United Nations, and who had not only praised Hitler for the murder of 6 million Jews, but had proposed building a monument to Hitler, a move which prompted even the Soviet ambassador in Kampala to suggest to President Amin that he was going too far. This was the problem which faced the government of Israel. Over 100 men, women and children, innocent hostages, with terrorist guns pointed at them, and having no doubt whatsoever in anybody's mind as to the intention of these terrorists to carry out their wicked plan and slaughter innocent people as they have done in the past. This is the picture which must be in the mind's eye of the distinguished delegates as they discuss this problem. I regret many of the remarks made by the representative of Tanzania because I suspect that they do not reflect his true feelings or the true feelings of the government of Tanzania. I reject out of hand his ridiculous attempt to equate this Israeli rescue operation to save its passengers with an attack on Africa. How can the distinguished representative of Tanzania make such a remark? Would Africa have looked better if Palestinian terrorists, in connivance with President Amin, had slaughtered over 100 men, women and children? Would Africa have looked better with their blood, the blood of these innocent victims bespattering the soil of Africa? Who has besmirched Africa? Israel, for exercising its right to save its citizens in accordance with international law, or that racist regime in Uganda waging a heroic war against a defenseless old lady of 75? Who is threatening Africa? Israel, which has done so much to help so many African countries, including many today in the field of agriculture, of technology, of health, or the country which has dispatched this week 30 fighter planes as reinforcements to Uganda, namely the government of Libya? Against whom are these planes directed, and by whom are they flown? You know as well as I do that they are directed against Kenya and Tanzania, who have been threatened and continue to be threatened openly in statements by the president of Uganda, and that the planes are flown, amongst others, by PLO pilots. Who is threatening Africa and the Africans? Israel, whose refusal to be associated in any way with President Amin's proposal to invade and bomb Tanzania in 1972 brought about Uganda's break with Israel, or the head of the state who produced in Israel and in other countries, incidentally, maps describing his plans to invade Tanzania? Who has treated Africa with contempt, if not the president of Uganda, who has labeled the president of Tanzania a man of international stature and standing, in words which are despicable and disgusting, and which I do not wish to repeat because of the high regard which I and my people have for the president of Tanzania? The distinguished representative of Tanzania says he would have preferred principles to be given priority over expediency. What principles are you talking about? The principles of Uganda, which are reflected in the grim recital of murder, kidnapping, and banditry in the document distributed today by the distinguished foreign minister of Kenya? Have you said one word here against these Ugandan principles? Is it principle or expediency which brought you, the distinguished representative of a very distinguished country, to be a co-sponsor of this resolution with Libya, the paymaster and center of world terrorism, and the country which is supplying fighter aircraft to Uganda? You know as well as I do that those planes will not be used by Uganda against Israel. If you, my dear friend, wish to discuss principles and expediency, by all means let us do so. But let us spell them out too. Let us not be selective about principles and expediency, just as we should not be selective about terror and rescue operations. Mr. President, I can only reiterate what I said on Friday. Let us stop being selective. If terror is bad, it is bad everywhere, for everybody, and on every occasion. If it is bad, whatever the color, race, creed, or nationality of the terrorist. It is bad, whatever the color, race, creed, or nationality of the victim. That is the issue before us. That is the issue with which the United Nations has failed to deal. That is the issue which will plague the whole world until we deal with it. I listened to the remarks of the distinguished representative of Pakistan. Frankly, I would have accorded them more respect if they had not come from the delegate of a regime which has locked up its entire political opposition in jail. Here was the miserable apparition of the representative of a state whose own people were brutally driven out of Uganda by the racist regime of Idi Amin, falling over himself to ingratiate himself with the oppressors of his own kith and kin. How despicable can one be? The distinguished representative of the Soviet Union asked me why we did not quote the documents of the United Nations banning aggression in international relations. The distinguished representative of the Soviet Union must be aware that the definition of aggression adopted by the General Assembly on the 15th of December 1974 has been widely criticized in all legal circles. It is not a binding statement of international law and does not incidentally rule out an act like that carried out by Israel. When the distinguished delegate of the Soviet Union asked why Israel did not file a complaint to the Security Council, I don't know whether he is naive or he assumes that I am naive. Let me assure him that at least in this respect, I cannot be characterized as such, and I have no doubt but that he is anything but naive. I asked the distinguished representative of the Soviet Union, had we submitted a complaint, would the Soviet Union have supported us? Why was there no Soviet statement when the plane was hijacked? Why have they not condemned the terrorist acts of the PLO on many occasions in the past? Why did they not issue a statement or an appeal when the innocent hostages were being held in Entebbe? Why didn't the distinguished representative of the Soviet Union have even one word to say about the fate of Mrs. Dora Bloch? Or one word of appeal directly to the representative of Uganda in this respect? After all, you have influence in Uganda. Is the distinguished representative of the Soviet Union not aware that since 1954, the Soviet Union has blocked every attempt on the part of Israel to bring its case to the Security Council? For 22 years, we have had no remedy in this council because of the Soviet veto. We are used, Mr. President, to cynicism in this body, But the cynical question of the representative of the Soviet Union, why didn't we complain to this council, when he knows in advance that without regard to the substance of the claim he would have vetoed it, is, I submit, the height of cynicism. I note the Soviet representative's concern for the inviolability of African territory, and I sincerely trust that his touching concern will be reflected in Soviet Union policies and actions. The distinguished representative of the Soviet Union talked about aggression and the inviolability of territorial integrity and national sovereignty. On these subjects I defer to him, having regard to the Soviet Union's very considerable record in these respects in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, and in other countries in Eastern Europe. My distinguished colleague from China could doubtless elaborate on this subject. Let me assure the distinguished delegate of the Soviet Union that the people of Hungary in 1956 and of Czechoslovakia in 1968 would have been only too delighted if the Soviet intervention had been to save 100 hostages and had been of a duration not exceeding 53 minutes, as was the case at Entebbe. At that time, the Soviet Union went to great pains to explain its position. Sergei Kovalev, in Sovereignty and the International Duties of Socialist Countries, published in Pravda on the 26th of September 1968, explained the Soviet Union's justifications of such actions as follows, and I quote, "Those who talk about the, quote, illegal, unquote, actions of the Allied socialist countries in Czechoslovakia forget that in a class society there is not and there cannot be law that is independent of class," unquote. Mr. President, in a civilized society there is not and cannot be law that is independent of the loftiest principles of man, namely freedom and dignity of man. That, my distinguished colleague from the Soviet Union, was the principle that Israel was defending at Entebbe. Perhaps the more indicative of all in attitudes of governments was the document from Algeria circulated to this council and which was welcomed yesterday by the representative of the Soviet Union. It is indeed appropriate that Algeria should speak out for the terrorists and hijackers, having regard to the fact that it was Algeria to which the first hijacked plane in operations against Israel in 1968 was directed. Algeria was directly involved in that operation and blazed the way for future terrorist exploits. One could hardly expect Algeria, which has played such a prominent part in the history of air hijacking, international kidnapping, and the use of diplomatic immunity for terrorist purposes, to forfeit its place in the Hall of Fame of international terrorism. They had to get into the act. After all, what Amin did 2 weeks ago, they did in 1968. Mr. President, in the course of all these discussions, some delegations have tended to ignore the group which organized this hijacking, namely the PLO. The PLO has issued a statement disassociating itself from this operation. This is a lie. The PFLP, to which the hijackers belonged, is a constituent member of the PLO. The PLO's record policy is a matter of record. It is one based on the most brutal terrorism, in the course of which attacks have been made upon innocent people, including unsuspecting women and children. These gangs have cut down pregnant women in cold blood in Kiryat Shmone, have shot Olympic athletes bound hand and foot, have hijacked planes, have engaged in open assassination, have held small school children hostage in Ma'alot, causing the death of over 20 children and over 60 wounded. These are the same individuals who tried to impose a reign of terror on the Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza, killing cold-bloodedly those suspected of not agreeing with them. These are the people who have been instrumental in destroying the Lebanese state, tearing it apart while this council remains silent, killing tens of thousands and wounding thousands of others. These are the people who have brought misery, murder and assassination to the area of the Middle East and who have introduced terrorism as a form of international idiom. Terrorism which affects innocent people wherever they may be. I note too, if I am already discussing Arab compliance and terrorism, that the government of Egypt has co-sponsored the decision of the OAU to bring this matter before the Council. Let me remind the Council that the government of Egypt released the cowardly assassins who shot Prime Minister Wasfi Tal of Jordan on the steps of the Sheraton Hotel in Cairo and who then drank his blood. The government of Egypt released the terrorists in 1970 from the Black September organization who landed the hijacked Pan American jumbo plane in Cairo airport and blew it up at that airport. Mr. President, I listened carefully to the long drawn-out point of order yesterday made by the representative of Libya, and I must admit I quite appreciate his concern, which was expressed by him today too. Who but the representative of Libya, a country which has been the paymaster and haven of international terrorism, would want to avoid a discussion in this Council on this evil international terrorism? Libya's role in supporting international terrorism financially, militarily and politically, and its involvement in assassination attempts of foreign leaders, including Arab heads of state, is known to all of us, and I need not repeat it here. However, the motivation behind the timing of the point of order is quite clear in view of information revealed over the weekend by the President of Egypt. In an interview with the Egyptian newspaper Akhbar al-Yawm, as reported by the Middle East News Agency on the 10th of July, President Sadat, who only last week expelled the Libyan ambassador for complicity in acts of terror, discussed publicly and on the record Libya's criminal involvement in international terror. It is apparent that Libya is the haven and refuge for the most wanted international terrorists whose colleagues were among those who carried out the hijacking of an Air France plane to Uganda. Indeed, while the deliberations in this Council were proceeding, forces financed and backed by Libya were actively continuing subversive operations in Sudan against the government of Sudan. What further evidence is necessary to prove that Libya has forfeited its right to vote on this question, and indeed is disqualified to be a member of the Security Council, a body charged with the duty to promote international peace and security? Mr. President, in conclusion, may I express my appreciation to those delegates who had the courage to take a stand clearly and unequivocally on the side of human decency and human freedom, and against the scourge of international terror, and those countries who support it, whether by commission or omission. The eloquent and moving statement by the distinguished representative of the United States of America, Governor Scranton, and the call of all the other delegations who urged this body to take action must evoke an echo throughout the world, regardless of political differences. I urge those countries who have already expressed their views on this issue at this table to join together to take action against hijackers and international terrorism. I am sure that many will follow their lead. This meeting will decide in more ways than one whether the United Nations will continue its downward path in the grip of despots or will reassume its rightful role on behalf of humanity